Before Ragnar Lothbrok, Vikings were pirates. After Ragnar Lothbrok, Vikings were conquerors. And the difference between those two things changed the entire course of European history. The show gave you a warrior, a man with an axe, a shield, and a hunger for glory. But the real Ragnar wasn't dangerous because he could fight. Every Viking could fight. Ragnar was dangerous because he could think. He invented an entirely new way of waging war that no European army had ever seen before. A system so effective, so devastating, so impossible to counter that Christian kings spent decades trying to figure out how to stop it. Most of them failed. Today, you'll discover 3 military innovations that Ragnar Lothbrok created that changed warfare forever. First, how he turned rivers into invisible highways, in allowing Viking armies to strike cities hundreds of kilometers inland that had never seen a warship in their entire history. Second, how he built the first intelligence network in medieval Europe, using merchants, slaves, and fake Christian converts to spy on every court in England and France years before he attacked. And third, how he invented psychological warfare as a military strategy, using calculated massacres, mutilated hostages, and public terror to defeat armies 10 times his size without ever fighting them. Every military tactic you associate with Viking warfare, the river raids, the terror, the speed, the unpredictability, did not exist before Ragnar. He invented all of it. And by the time he sailed 120 ships up the Seine to humiliate Paris in 845 AD, he had created a military system so advanced that European armies would not develop effective countermeasures for another 50 years. The axe made him a warrior. But what made him the most dangerous man in 9th century Europe was something no saga ever celebrated: his mind. Before Ragnar, the North Sea was a barrier. After Ragnar, it was a weapon. And the man who turned geography itself into a tool of conquest was about to rewrite the rules of war for an entire continent. Before Ragnar, Viking raids were simple, predictable, almost lazy. A handful of longships would cross the North Sea in summer. They would find a coastal monastery or an undefended fishing village. They would land at dawn, take what they could carry: silver, livestock, slaves, and leave before any local army could respond. By the time a Saxon or Frankish king heard about the raid, the Vikings were already 200 kilometers away, drinking mead on their own shores. It worked, but it was limited. Coastal raids could never generate serious wealth. Monasteries near the shore had already been stripped bare by the late 820s. The easy targets were gone, and the English and Frankish kingdoms had begun to adapt. Coastal watchtowers, warning beacons, garrison troops stationed near vulnerable harbors. The old Viking playbook was dying. And this is where most Viking leaders would have stopped, would have accepted that the age of easy plunder was ending, would have settled for smaller raids and diminishing returns. But Ragnar looked at the same problem and saw something completely different. He didn't see the end of Viking warfare. He saw the beginning of something new. Because while every other jarl was staring at the coastline, wondering which monastery still had gold, Ragnar was staring at the rivers: the Seine, the Thames, the Loire, the Rhine. Massive waterways that cut through the heart of European kingdoms like veins through a body. Rivers that led directly to the richest cities on the continent. Cities that had never built defenses against naval attack because no one had ever attacked them from the water. Why would they? Armies marched on roads. Navies fought on oceans. Rivers were for trade, for fishing, for transportation. The idea of using a river as an invasion highway was so alien to 9th century military thinking that no European commander had ever considered defending against it. But Ragnar had a weapon that made river warfare possible: the Viking longship, shallow draft, flexible keel, capable of sailing in open ocean and navigating rivers barely 2 meters deep, light enough to be carried overland between waterways, fast enough to outrun any pursuit. The longship was the most versatile military vessel in the world, and every other Viking was using it to raid fishing villages. Was it genius that Ragnar saw the potential? Or was it simply that everyone else was blind? The answer doesn't matter. What matters is what happened next. Because Ragnar didn't just theorize about river warfare, he tested it. Between 830 and 840 AD, he began launching experimental raids up the rivers of France and England. Small fleets, limited objectives, not attacking cities yet, just mapping the waterways, measuring the depths, noting where rivers narrowed and where they widened, identifying which tributaries connected to which trade routes, which cities sat on riverbanks with their walls facing inland, never imagining that danger could come from the water. Ragnar was building a map, not on parchment, in his head. A complete strategic picture of every major river system in Western Europe, every vulnerability, every blind spot, every city that thought it was safe because it was far from the sea. And when that map was complete, the age of the coastal raid was over. The age of Ragnar had begun. Between 835 and 845 AD, Ragnar didn't just improve Viking warfare, he reinvented it from the ground up. 5 innovations, 5 weapons that no European army had ever faced, each one devastating on its own. Together, they were unstoppable. The first weapon was river warfare. Ragnar launched his first major river raid around 835 AD. A fleet of longships sailing up a French river toward a town that had never seen a warship. The defenders didn't even understand what they were looking at. Ships coming from upstream? Warships on a river? By the time the local garrison realized what was happening, Ragnar's men were already inside the walls. The town fell in hours. No siege, and no prolonged battle, just speed, surprise, and a rout of attack that nobody thought was possible. Word spread among other jarls. Ragnar shared his river maps selectively, enough to recruit allies, never enough to create rivals. Within a few years, every ambitious Viking leader was begging Ragnar for permission to join his expeditions. Not because he was the strongest fighter, because he was the only one who knew where the rivers led. The second weapon was psychological terror. Every Viking raider used violence. Ragnar turned violence into communication. He didn't just attack monasteries, he attacked the most sacred, most symbolic monasteries, places that Christian kings believed God himself protected. When those places burned, the message was clear. Your God cannot save you. Your prayers are useless. Your walls are meaningless. But Ragnar went further. After every major raid, he left bodies displayed in deliberate arrangements, hanging from trees along roads, positioned outside city gates, not random cruelty, calculated messaging. Every displayed body was a billboard that said the same thing. Ragnar Lothbrok was here. Ragnar Lothbrok is coming back, and there is nothing you can do. Was it sadism? Or was it the coldest military logic imaginable? The effect was measurable. Cities began surrendering before Ragnar even arrived. Kings began paying tribute without a single battle. Entire regions evacuated at the rumor of his approach. Ragnar had discovered something that no European commander understood yet. Terror is cheaper than war. One well-executed massacre in the right place saves you 10 battles you never have to fight. The third weapon was the hostage economy. Other Vikings killed captives or sold them as slaves. Ragnar kept the valuable ones alive: bishops, nobles, sons of kings. He held them hostage and sent proof of life to their families: a lock of hair, a ring, a severed finger. Then he demanded ransom, enormous ransoms that drained entire kingdoms. But here was the brutal innovation. When the ransom was paid and the hostage returned, Ragnar sent them back, mutilated, alive but destroyed, blinded, tongueless, missing hands. Because a dead hostage becomes a martyr that inspires resistance. A mutilated hostage becomes a walking warning that destroys morale. Every noble family in England and France knew that if Ragnar captured your son, you would get him back, but you would not want to see what came home. The fourth weapon was intelligence. Ragnar built a spy network across Christian Europe decades before any medieval kingdom had a formal intelligence service. Scandinavian merchants who spoke Latin, Norse traders who converted to Christianity on the surface and attended markets, taverns, and court gatherings across England and France. They reported everything: where gold was stored, where armies were stationed, which kings were fighting each other, which cities had weak walls, which monasteries had been recently enriched by royal donations. Ragnar knew where to attack months before his ships appeared. He knew which coasts were undefended. He knew which kings were distracted by internal conflicts. He knew exactly when and where to strike for maximum damage and minimum resistance. No other Viking leader had this advantage. No Christian king understood why Ragnar always seemed to be one step ahead. The fifth weapon was simultaneous multi-front attack. Before Ragnar, Viking fleets attacked one target at a time. Ragnar divided his forces into multiple smaller fleets and attacked several targets simultaneously across hundreds of kilometers. When a Christian king mobilized his army to defend one city, Ragnar's second fleet was already burning another. When that army marched to save the second city, the first fleet had already regrouped and was hitting a third target. The English and Frankish kingdoms had no answer for this. Their armies were slow, road-bound, and could only be in one place at a time. Ragnar's fleets were fast, river-mobile, and everywhere at once. He invented the strategy of exhaustion, forcing his enemies to chase ghosts until their armies collapsed from fatigue, their treasuries ran dry, and their kings had no choice but to pay him to leave. 5 weapons: river warfare, psychological terror, hostage economics, intelligence networks, multi-front attacks, combined into a single integrated system of warfare that turned a collection of coastal pirates into the most effective military force in 9th century Europe. And Ragnar was about to demonstrate all 5 simultaneously against the greatest target of all. Paris, spring, 845 AD. 120 Viking longships enter the mouth of the Seine River. On the decks, 5,000 warriors. At the head, a lean man with cold blue eyes who is about to execute the most sophisticated military operation medieval Europe has ever witnessed. Every one of Ragnar's 5 weapons will be deployed in the next 30 days. Paris is not just a target, it is a demonstration, a proof of concept, a masterclass in the new warfare Ragnar has spent 15 years perfecting. And the most powerful Christian kingdom in Europe has no idea what is about to hit it. Weapon 1: river warfare. The Seine is wide, deep, and leads directly to the heart of the Frankish Empire. Ragnar's longships glide upriver at a speed that Frankish messengers on horseback can barely match. Towns along the banks see the dragon prows and panic. By the time reports reach King Charles the Bald in Paris, Ragnar is already halfway there. The river that the Franks used for trade and transport has been turned into an invasion highway, but Ragnar doesn't rush. He doesn't race toward Paris. He moves deliberately, stopping at key points along the river. And this is where Weapon 2 begins. Psychological terror. At every stop along the Seine, Ragnar attacks a visible target: a riverside church, a wealthy estate, a small fortified town. He doesn't just raid them, he destroys them completely, burns them to the foundation, and he leaves the bodies of the defenders displayed along the riverbanks, visible from the water, visible from the roads. Why? Because Ragnar knows that refugees flee toward the capital. Every destroyed town sends hundreds of panicked civilians rushing to Paris, screaming about the monsters on the river. By the time Ragnar's fleet reaches the outskirts of Paris, And the city is already flooded with terrified refugees. Food supplies are strained. Clean water is running out. Disease is beginning to spread. The population is on the edge of hysteria. Ragnar hasn't touched Paris yet, and the city is already destroying itself from the inside. Weapon 3. Intelligence. Ragnar knows exactly what he will find at Paris because his network has been reporting for years. He knows the city's walls are strong, but the garrison is undermanned. He knows Charles the Bald is politically weak, a young king surrounded by advisors who hate each other. He knows which nobles are loyal and which ones are looking for any excuse to abandon the crown. He knows where the gold is stored. He knows the layout of the bridges. He knows everything. And now, Weapon 4, the hostage economy. Before approaching Paris directly, Ragnar targets the Abbey of Saint-Germain-des-Prés on the opposite bank of the Seine, a wealthy monastery full of gold relics and high-ranking monks. He attacks at dawn. The assault lasts less than an hour. The monks who survive are captured. The gold is loaded onto ships. The abbey is burned. But Ragnar doesn't kill the captured monks. He holds them. He sends word to Charles that he has prisoners of immense spiritual and political value, abbots, senior clergy, men whose deaths would shake the Frankish church to its foundation. The ransom demand is implied before it is even spoken, and from the walls of Paris, defenders watch black smoke rising from across the river. The message is devastating. Paris cannot protect a monastery on the other side of its own river. How will it protect itself? Charles the Bald convenes a desperate war council. His generals want to fight. His bishops want to pray. His treasury advisors are calculating the cost of resistance versus the cost of surrender. And in the middle of this chaos, Ragnar deploys his fifth and final weapon. He waits. 3 days. 4. 5. The fleet anchored within sight of Paris but just beyond arrow range. No attack, no demands, no negotiation. Just 120 longships sitting silently on the river, while Paris tears itself apart with fear and indecision. This is Weapon 5 in its purest form, the strategy of exhaustion. Ragnar doesn't need to attack Paris. He needs Paris to exhaust itself. Every day the city doesn't fight. It gets weaker. Soldiers stand on walls for hours and see nothing. Adrenaline spikes and crashes. Sleep deprivation. Food rationing. Wars rumors multiply. Paranoia spreads. The garrison that was ready to fight on day 1 is hollow and demoralized by day 5. And then Ragnar sends a messenger, not with a battle cry, with a number, 7,000 pounds of gold and silver. The price for leaving. Charles the Bald is humiliated. His advisors are divided. The church demands resistance. The treasury screams that resistance will cost more than the ransom. The generals know their demoralized garrison cannot match 5,000 battle-hardened Vikings who have been resting for 5 days while the defenders haven't slept. Charles caves. He pays. 7,000 pounds. An astronomical fortune that will take the Frankish kingdom years to recover. But Ragnar isn't finished, because this is not about the gold. The gold is a bonus. This is about the demonstration. In the proof that his system works, he demands entry into Paris, not to loot, not to burn, just to enter, to walk through the streets of the greatest Christian city in Western Europe, to prove that he can. Charles, already broken, agrees. On Easter Sunday, 845 AD, Ragnar Lothbrok and his warriors walk through the streets of Paris. No battle, no siege, no blood. Just Vikings strolling through the capital of Christendom while the citizens watch in stunned silence. Ragnar enters the cathedral, studies the stained glass, examines the golden altars, stands before the great crucifix, and simply looks at it. And then he leaves, loads his gold, sails back down the Seine, and on the way out, he captures 111 Frankish prisoners, soldiers, nobles, merchants, and hangs them from trees on islands visible from Paris, not for revenge. E for advertising, because Ragnar knows that every detail of this campaign will be recorded by Frankish chroniclers, every tactic documented, every humiliation preserved in ink. And when other Viking leaders read those accounts, and they will see the proof that Ragnar's system works. River warfare, psychological terror, intelligence, hostage economics, and the strategy of exhaustion, combined, perfected, demonstrated against the greatest city in Europe. The sack of Paris wasn't just a victory, it was a product launch, the most devastating military operating system the medieval world had ever seen. And Ragnar had just shown every Viking in Scandinavia exactly how to use it. The effect was immediate. Within months of Paris, every ambitious jarl in Scandinavia was copying Ragnar's playbook. River raids exploded across Europe. The Seine, the Thames, the Loire, the Rhine, waterways that had been safe for centuries were suddenly highways of destruction. But they weren't just copying individual tactics. They were copying the system, the complete integrated approach that Ragnar had demonstrated. Intelligence first, then psychological preparation, then river penetration, then siege by exhaustion, then ransom extraction. The full sequence executed in order again and again across every kingdom in Western Europe. The Frankish kingdoms tried to respond. Charles the Bald spent years building fortified bridges across the Seine to block river access. Other kings erected chains across river mouths. Watchtowers were built along every major waterway. Garrison troops were permanently stationed at inland cities for the first time in European history. But every countermeasure was reactive. Every defense was designed to stop what Ragnar had already done. And by the time the Franks built a bridge, Ragnar's imitators had already found another river. The defensive infrastructure of medieval Europe was fundamentally reshaped by one man's innovation. Castles moved from hilltops to river crossings. Town walls were extended to cover waterfront approaches. Naval patrols were created for inland waterways. An entire civilization reorganized its military architecture because of tactics that one Viking invented on the open water. Was that Ragnar's intention? Did he understand that he was changing the world? The sagas don't say, but the evidence speaks for itself. In the Dangeld, the practice of paying Vikings to leave became the standard European response to Norse attacks for the next 2 centuries. Kings across England and France taxed their own people into poverty to pay ransoms that Ragnar's model had proven were cheaper than war. The economic system of medieval Europe was permanently distorted by a strategy one man perfected against Paris in 845. The great heathen army that invaded England in 865, led by Ragnar's own sons, used every weapon in his playbook. River penetration up the Humber and the Trent, psychological terror through calculated massacres, intelligence gathered from Scandinavian merchants embedded in English markets, multi-front attacks that divided Saxon forces, the strategy of exhaustion that forced kingdoms to surrender one by one. While Ivar the Boneless didn't invent the plan that conquered England, he inherited it from his father, and the legacy extended beyond the Viking Age itself. Military historians have traced the influence of Ragnar's river warfare tactics through the Norman invasions of the 11th century. William the Conqueror, a direct descendant of Viking settlers in France, used river and coastal mobility in his invasion of England in 1066. The same principles, the same logic. 200 years later, and Ragnar's innovations were still winning wars. But here is the darkest part of the legacy. Ragnar didn't just change how wars were fought, he changed what war meant. Before Ragnar, warfare in Europe was primarily about territorial control. Armies meeting on battlefields to decide who ruled which piece of land. Ragnar introduced something new. War as economics, war as psychology, war as information warfare, war as brand management. He understood that the purpose of violence was not to destroy your enemy, but to change their behavior, to make them so afraid, so exhausted, so economically drained that they give you what you want without you ever having to fight them. Terror as strategy, intelligence as weapon, fear as currency. These concepts feel modern. They feel like they belong in a 21st century military textbook. But a Viking from 9th century Scandinavia figured them out 1,200 years ago, standing on the prow of a wooden ship, staring at a river that everyone else thought was safe. The show gave you a warrior who swung an axe. History gave you the man who made the axe unnecessary, who proved that the most dangerous weapon in warfare is not steel or fire or numbers. It is the mind that knows exactly where to point them. Ragnar Lothbrok didn't conquer Europe with strength. He conquered it with a system, and that system is still being studied, still being copied, still being feared. 12 centuries after the man who invented it died in a pit full of snakes, smiling because he knew that even his death was just another move in the game. If you want to discover the minds that reshaped history through pure strategic genius, subscribe now. Ragnar invented the playbook, but the generals who came after him made it even more terrifying.